Today, I've got a chilling collection of 3 stories about pet-sitting jobs that didn't go as planned. What starts as a simple favor for a friend or family quickly takes a dark turn in ways no one could have expected. These stories are longer, detailed, and more unsettling than anything I've shared before. So grab a blanket, settle in, and prepare for over an hour of haunting pet-sitting stories that will keep you awake tonight. Story 1. The Cat That Went Missing. Emily had agreed to house-sit for her friend Mia, who was going on a week-long vacation. It seemed simple enough. Mia had a single pet, a black cat named Midnight, and all Emily had to do was feed him, keep him company, and make sure the house was locked up each night. With her college finals just over, Emily thought the week would be a perfect chance to relax and catch up on sleep in Mia's cozy, old Victorian-style house. But that was before strange things began happening. On her first night, Emily settled into the guest room, which was tucked away on the second floor of the house. Midnight was affectionate and seemed to follow her everywhere, his yellow eyes watching her closely. She found it oddly comforting, as the house had an unsettling quietness at night. The old wood floors creaked, and the tall windows rattled faintly with the evening wind. But Emily brushed it off. It was just an old house after all. After a relaxing dinner and a little TV, Emily decided to call it a night. She made sure Midnight had food and water, and left him curled up in his bed in the living room. The house was dark and silent as she climbed the stairs. Just as she was dozing off, a sudden noise jolted her awake. The unmistakable sound of the TV turning on downstairs, the volume set far too high. She sat up, her heart racing. She remembered switching it off before going to bed. Maybe the remote was defective? Trying to shake off the uneasy feeling, Emily got out of bed and walked down the creaky stairs, feeling Midnight's absence as she scanned the room. To her relief, the remote was lying untouched on the couch. She picked it up, turned the TV off, and waited a moment to see if it would turn on again. When nothing happened, she shrugged it off as a fluke and headed back upstairs. But that's when she noticed. Midnight wasn't waiting at her feet as he usually was. She hadn't seen him since dinner. "Midnight," she called softly. Silence. A chill prickled her skin, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Come on, buddy. Where are you?" She searched the living room, the kitchen, and even the basement, but there was no sign of him. She was just starting to get worried when she heard a faint scratching sound coming from the attic door at the end of the hallway. Her stomach tightened. Mia had specifically mentioned that Midnight was not allowed in the attic, that he'd always seemed spooked by it and stayed away. Yet, the scratching grew louder, almost frantic. Emily took a deep breath, trying to shake off the feeling of dread building in her chest, and approached the door. "Midnight, are you in there?" she whispered, not really expecting a response. She turned the doorknob slowly, the old hinges groaning as she pushed it open. The attic was dark, colder than the rest of the house, and she could smell the faint scent of dust and mildew. She switched on her phone's flashlight, sweeping it over the stacks of boxes and old furniture that filled the space. And then she saw him. Midnight sat in the middle of the attic floor, still as a statue, his yellow eyes fixed on her. But he wasn't looking directly at her. His gaze was focused on something behind her. Emily's skin crawled, a prickling sensation running down her spine. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the doorway was empty. "Come on, Midnight," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. She took a step forward, reaching out, but Midnight didn't move. His body was tense, and his fur stood on end. Emily felt the hairs on her arms stand up, and a chill ran through her as she realized Midnight wasn't looking at her. He was looking through her, as if he could see something she couldn't. Ignoring the rising panic, Emily finally managed to scoop him up, his body rigid and unyielding in her arms. She backed out of the attic, never taking her eyes off the doorway, and quickly shut the door, the latch clicking with a sharp finality. She carried Midnight downstairs, setting him gently on the couch, but he immediately jumped down, his yellow eyes tracking something unseen around the room. For the rest of the night, Emily kept every light in the house on. She lay on the couch with Midnight by her side, the TV playing softly in the background. She barely slept, her mind racing, replaying every strange occurrence, every creak and whisper in the old house. Around 3 a.m., she heard footsteps on the stairs. She held her breath, gripping the blanket, but no one came down. And then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of scratching coming from the attic door again, faint but persistent, as if something was trying to get out. By dawn, Emily had decided she would never set foot in that attic again. She spent the rest of her week keeping to the main floor, never leaving Midnight alone, and trying to convince herself that it was just her imagination. But the sense of unease lingered, like a shadow that followed her every move. When Mia returned, Emily told her friend about the strange events. She kept her tone light, half laughing, but Mia's reaction was anything but amused. Her face went pale, and she glanced nervously at the attic door. I should have told you," Mia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This house, it has a history. The previous owners said they sometimes felt like they weren't alone. I thought it was just their imagination, but..." Her voice trailed off, and she looked away, visibly uncomfortable. Emily left that day, feeling an immense sense of relief as she drove away from the house. But the memory of that week lingered with her. The feeling of Midnight's gaze fixed on something she couldn't see, and the sound of scratching in the night. She still wonders what might have been lurking in that attic, hidden just out of sight, watching, waiting. Story 2. The Mysterious Phone Calls. Jake had done plenty of house-sitting jobs before, but none had given him the uneasy feeling he felt with this one. He'd been hired to watch over a modern, spacious home in a quiet, affluent neighborhood while its owners were on a week-long vacation. His main task was to care for the couple's 2 dogs, Max and Toby, who were large but gentle and incredibly obedient. The job seemed simple enough, but Jake had an eerie feeling about this particular house, a feeling he tried to ignore. By the first night, however, that feeling would become impossible to dismiss. As the evening wore on, Jake settled on the couch with the dogs at his feet, watching TV to unwind. The house was comfortable, and the dogs were relaxed, lazily stretching out beside him. Around 10 p.m., just as he was considering calling it a night, the phone rang. Jake found it odd. He hadn't expected any calls, and didn't think anyone even knew he was there. Curious, he picked up the phone, expecting to hear the homeowner's voice checking in, but instead, there was only silence on the other end, a heavy, unsettling silence. Then, faintly, he could hear breathing, slow and deliberate. Jake felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Hello," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, but there was no response. The line clicked, and the call ended abruptly. Jake shook it off, assuming it had been a wrong number, and went upstairs to the guest room. Just as he began to relax again, the phone rang once more. He hesitated before answering, his hand hovering over the receiver. Finally, he picked up. This time, he heard a man's voice, a low, gravelly whisper that sent a shiver down his spine. "I found your wallet," the voice said slowly, as if savoring each word. Jake froze, confusion clouding his mind. His wallet was in his bag, safely zipped up and untouched. "Who is this?" he asked, trying to sound braver than he felt. But there was no answer. The line went dead again. Heart pounding, Jake checked his bag, reassuring himself that his wallet was indeed there. This was definitely not a wrong number. Trying to shake off his unease, he checked on the dogs, who were both at the door, staring into the darkened hallway with their hackles raised, growling softly. It was as if they, too, sensed something wasn't right. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, and the quiet house around him seemed suddenly vast and empty, every shadow a possible hiding place. The calls came again the next night, each one more disturbing than the last. Each time, the same raspy voice would whisper, "I found your wallet." By the third call, Jake was fed up. He demanded to know who was calling, but there was only a faint chuckle, and then the line went dead. That night, he triple-checked all the locks on the doors and windows, feeling a growing sense of dread. He tried to sleep, but his mind kept drifting to the disturbing calls and the stranger's eerie, taunting words. Around 2 a.m., Jake was startled awake by the phone ringing again. This time he didn't answer, letting the phone ring until it fell silent. But a few minutes later, it rang again, and again. The relentless ringing was unnerving, echoing through the quiet house, growing louder and more insistent with each call. The dogs began to whine and pace anxiously, their agitation matching Jake's growing fear. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He picked up the phone, his hand shaking as he held it to his ear. Before he could speak, the voice on the other end spoke, louder and clearer than before. "I'm outside," the voice whispered. "I'll leave your wallet by the door." Jake's breath caught in his throat, and he froze. He glanced toward the front door, his mind racing. His first instinct was to lock himself in the guest room, but he felt compelled to check the door, just to be sure. Moving slowly, he crept down the stairs, his footsteps silent as he approached the front door. The porch light illuminated the steps, but the rest of the yard was swallowed in darkness. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and pulled the door open, but there was no one there. The night was silent, save for the rustling of the wind in the trees. Jake looked down, expecting to see his wallet or something else on the doorstep, but there was nothing there, only the chilling emptiness of the dark street. The calls stopped after that night, but Jake's unease lingered. He spent the rest of the week in a state of heightened vigilance, unable to relax, always looking over his shoulder. When the homeowners finally returned, Jake recounted the strange events, hoping they'd have an explanation. But they just looked at him, baffled. No one had access to the house number, and they didn't recognize the voice he described. To this day, Jake doesn't know who was calling him or what their intentions were. All he knows is that the quiet, affluent house became a place of fear and dread, haunted by the whispers of a stranger who seemed to know exactly where he was, watching him in the dark. Story 3. The Secret Guest. Lisa had taken on a house-sitting job for a quiet, retired couple, John and Alice, who were heading out of town for the week. She'd be caring for their parrot, Polly, a bright green bird with a vibrant personality. The couple's home was a charming bungalow on a wooded property, set back from the road with only a few neighbors nearby. It was peaceful, almost idyllic, but from the moment Lisa arrived, she felt an odd chill she couldn't explain. The first night was uneventful. Lisa settled into the guest room, Polly's cage covered nearby so he could sleep. The house was old but comfortable, filled with antiques and thick, creaky floorboards. Lisa couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but she convinced herself it was just nerves in a new place. By the second day, however, strange things started happening. In the mornings, she'd find small things out of place. A glass moved from one counter to another, lights that she was sure she'd turned off left on, and Polly, the parrot, would squawk loudly whenever she tried to leave the room. He would stare at the corners, his head cocked, as if he were listening to something she couldn't hear. Lisa tried to laugh it off, chalking it up to Polly's quirks and her own overactive imagination. On the third night, Lisa woke up to the sound of soft footsteps outside her door. Her heart raced as she lay frozen, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped right outside her door, and she could hear faint breathing, low and steady. Holding her breath, she whispered, "Hello? Is someone there?" There was a long silence, and then she heard a voice, a calm, quiet voice, just on the other side of the door. "Oh, I didn't mean to scare you," the voice said, soft and almost amused. She opened the door, expecting no one, but there stood John, the homeowner, staring at her with an unsettling smile. "I didn't mention," he said, "I sometimes come home early. I sleep here too, sometimes." Lisa backed away, speechless. She hadn't seen any car outside, hadn't heard him arrive. The house had been silent all night. Her skin prickled as she realized he had been watching her, moving things around, waiting. She left early the next morning, unable to shake the feeling that John had been lingering in the shadows, observing her every move. I hope you guys have enjoyed the stories. Thumbs up for more stories.